Good evening. The report out.
Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Did anybody watch any baseball this week? I was just curious. Okay, I'm not going to talk about. I was gonna bring up a broom with me this week. I didn't want to be insensitive because I know we all come from different places. Anyway, go Cardinals. Hey, I'm glad that you are here this morning. Chelsea, you're getting mad, aren't you? Yeah, that's fine. I'm glad you're here with us today, both here and then those of you joining us online. Today we are beginning a brand new message series that I could not be more excited for. I know you're probably saying, Kyle, you said that about the last sermon series and the one before that, and I probably did. But I'm really excited about this one because we are studying through the book of Daniel, who is one of my biggest heroes in the entire Bible, and you'll probably learn why as we go throughout this series. But I think you'll find these next several weeks together to be extremely applicable because the big idea that we're going to be really discussing about and talking about is how we can live a godly life in an ungodly age, which sounds a lot like something we need to know about, right? How to live godly lives in an ungodly age. And if I could sum up really this whole series in one statement, it would be with this. You will either change the world or you will be changed by the world. You will either change the world or you will be changed by the world. So basically, you're either going to stand firm with what you believe, or what you believe will be altered and changed and shaped by our world, because we live in a very influential culture. And that's true, both whether you say you're a Christian or if you're in here and you're just searching, you don't know exactly what you believe. It's the first time in church in a long time and you're trying to figure out this whole God thing and where you stand. We all know that we're living in a culture that's very, very slippery, that's changing a lot, and not necessarily for the better. In fact, a lot of non-Christians today who would say, I don't even believe in God, but I'm still a decent person, moral person, would still say that we live in a really dark time. We live in a world that's going downhill very, very quickly. I mean, especially if you've been watching the news at all with just some of the things that are happening out on the East Coast, which are absolutely horrible, which we firmly stand against racism in any form as a church. It is evil. It is from Satan and the enemy. And the church needs to not just talk about it. The church needs to actually lead the way in doing something about it. And so we need to be praying diligently for peoples of every race, because I love what Revelation says. Revelation makes clear that every tribe, tongue, and nation will be standing before the Father. And so there is a lot of things. There's a lot of things that as a church we need to have a presence in. And again, talking about it isn't enough. We need to actually do something about it. You know, we need to put our love into action. And so as we think about just these ungodly times and how to live a godly life, I think one of the best examples we have in the entire Bible of how to do this is actually Daniel. Now, Daniel is not just the name of a person. Daniel's the name of a book in the Old Testament that we're going to be studying. And Daniel is what's known in the Old Testament as one of the major prophets. So in the Old Testament, you have major prophets and you have minor prophets. And really, here's the difference. The major prophets' books are just a little bit longer and the minor prophets' books are shorter. That's not saying that, you know, the major prophets are more important or what they say is better or that the minor prophets are less important. It's just basically talking about the length of the book. So that's who Daniel is. And just so you can understand the timeline of what's happening here, we're going to get to it, but we got to do some history lesson real quick. As Christians, we believe that there are 4,000 years between the creation of the world, which we read about in Genesis, 4,000 years between the creation of the world and when Jesus came. And right before Jesus came, there is a period of 400 years of silence. So what that means is for 400 years, like in the Old Testament, God is always talking to people. He's communicating to people. He's working miracles. You've got the prophets that are prophesying. But right before Jesus came, for 400 years, there was no words from the Lord. Okay, there was complete silence. There was no new prophecies. People were not encountering God at this time. And Daniel lived his life around 600 BC. And so he was one of the last prophets to speak and prophesy before the coming of Jesus. So that makes what he has to say really, really important. And that's why we need to understand a little bit about the setup of everything that's going on here to really get where we're going in this series of Daniel. Where we're going to pick up is this is a really dark time for Israel. Because where Daniel's story picks up, Israel's story seems to end. Now, it doesn't end, but it's not going well for them because a really evil king named Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon. Babylon is in modern day Iraq, but they had come and they had defeated Israel, which is actually all prophesied about. And this guy was so bad and so evil that not only did he just defeat Israel, he burned the temple. He got all the religious artifacts, everything that was really important, gathered those things together, had them all destroyed, because he was trying to make a point that his gods were stronger than the one true God of Israel. He was trying to make a point, saying, look what we've done. We've not only defeated you, we've not only defeated Jerusalem, but we've also burned your temple and burned anything resembling your God. So he was trying to make a point. My gods are stronger than your gods. Now here's the deal. There was a plan in all this. Only God can work bad together for good, right? All throughout the Old Testament, all throughout it, Israel is God's chosen people. And they were constantly, they were rebelling against God's law. In fact, if you read through the Old Testament, it's amazing. God shows up in absolutely miraculous ways, whether that's a pillar of fire from heaven, or whether that's sending manna, from heaven, or God just shows up in miraculous ways. And then if you go like one more chapter, the people get a little hungry, and so they'll build a statue of a calf or of a golden chihuahua, and they'll be like, well, God's gone, let's pray to that. Let's make this statue, and maybe that'll do the trick. So they're very quick to jump ship with their faith, and so God notices this. He notices their disobedience over and over, and God allows the Babylonians to conquer Israel. He allows it to happen for a time. Because remember, God has a plan, and his plans are greater than our plans. His ways are higher than our ways. So God has a plan in all this. So he allows Babylon to defeat Israel, and the Israelites who don't die are taken into captivity by the Babylons and taken to their main city of Babylon. Now, I know that was kind of boring, but we got to understand the context of the Bible to understand how the Bible really applies to us. So that's what we're going to pick up. If you have your Bibles, open them to the book of Daniel, chapter 1. It's towards the end of the Old Testament. If you don't have a Bible or you can't find Daniel, that's okay. Don't feel stupid. I can't find it most of the time either. So it'll be up on the screen for you to follow along. So Daniel chapter 1, we're going to start in verse 3. It says, the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch. A eunuch is a palace official who serves the king. But he ordered him to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. In other words, he said, go find those who are most likely to succeed, the best-looking and the brightest. Those are the ones that I want you to bring to me. And it says he was to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. So what the king is saying to this guy is, okay, we just defeated Israel, and so I want to take some of the young minds of Israel, and I want them to come and serve me. So bring me the best of the best that Israel has to offer, and I want you to teach them our language, teach them to speak like we speak, teach them to think like we think, teach them to do what we do, okay? And so verse 5. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years. Think like Babylonian captivity college, right? We go to school for like 4 years, some of us for 5 or 6. But these guys were like, okay, 3 years, all you're doing is you're learning. You're learning our language, you're learning our culture, you're learning everything about us. So they were like 12 hours a day in study mode. So he said, 3 years there to be trained, and then at the end of the time, they were to attend the king. Now, here's what I want you to notice. There was a very intentional and strategic plan by the king to completely indoctrinate them into their Babylonian culture. In other words, the king was trying to take these young men and turn them into Babylonians. He wanted them to abandon their culture. He wanted them to abandon their God, their entire way of living, and follow his ways and all the cultures of Babylon, which were not good. And what's interesting is that this is the same thing that our spiritual enemy, Satan, is trying to do to us today as well. Because Satan would love nothing more than for you to change who you are, to stop following the teachings of the one true God, and to follow what the world believes, following the changing culture of the world and of the times. So Satan really wants us to change who we are, what we believe, what we think, and he wants to get us to follow the standards of the world, right? He wants us to slowly move away from God's word. Really, the most dangerous thing that the enemy can do is make us think that sin is not a big deal. If he can get us to think that sin isn't that big of a deal, then he's doing his job well. Because let's think about it. Let's be honest. Some of us have some sin in our life, and instead of really being broken about that, we actually make it into more of a laughing matter. Oh, I know I struggle with this addiction, but yeah, that's just one of my vices. Or I know I drink too much, every now and then, but, that's just kind of who I am. We don't take sin seriously anymore. And we need to realize that sin is what separates us from God. So this is a big deal. All sin begins with one small compromise. Begins with one small compromise. One movie with just a little bit of nudity, but it's okay because it doesn't affect me. I'll cover my eyes. One time drinking a little too much at our work Christmas party. One time getting a little flirty over Facebook, Messenger, or text with someone who isn't my spouse. One time getting a little bit overly handsy with our boyfriend or girlfriend. You see what I'm talking about? Small compromises now lead to full-scale rebellion later. Because every time we sin, it takes us further and further and further away from God. One small compromise now, you may not realize it, but it can set you on the path to destruction. And so we need to somehow figure out how do we remain godly in a very godless age when it seems like the world, the culture, everything is just trying to pull us off focus. We're like cars that get out of alignment. Every now and then, when you get out of alignment, you start veering off. Sometimes we need to go to the mechanics and just get an alignment so we can kind of get straight again. And I think that's where a lot of us are. I think some of us are maybe a little bit out of alignment. We're starting to veer. So we need to go back to God and God's word and figure out how to get our life straightened out and how to change the world instead of being changed by the world. Charles Spurgeon has this thing he said, and it's one of my favorite quotes of all time. He said, "I believe that one reason why the Church of God at this present moment has so little influence over the world is because the world has so much influence over the church." The world has so much influence over the church. The world has more influence over the church than the church is having on the world right now. That's not the way it's supposed to be. But that's something that can and needs to be changed, because you will either change the world or you're going to be changed by the world. And this is why it's so important to not just know what you believe, but to hold fast to what you believe. Basically, what I'm saying is, if you go to college, I know we have some college students in here, if you've never made your faith your own, if you've always just kind of gone to church because that's what mom and dad said to do, then you've never had your own faith. And the first time it's challenged, guess what's going to happen? You're going to start making small compromises and veering off course. Because it was never your faith. It was just your mom or your dad's or your family's. That's why you need to know why you believe what you believe. What does the Bible say so that you can hold fast to it? You can't just be a lukewarm follower of Jesus. First of all, because God says so. And second of all, because it's just not possible in this world. It won't work to be a lukewarm follower of Jesus, because the world will have way too much influence on you if you're only following Jesus half-heartedly. You need to be a full-on committed follower of Christ, or you will be changed by the world. In fact, here's the way Paul puts it. in Romans. He says, do not be conformed to this age. What he's saying is, don't change with the culture, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. So, you're going to look like Jesus or look like the world, and it all depends on what you place at the center of your life. But to be a world changer, to be a follower of Jesus, means that you will stand out for what you believe. You will stand out for what you believe. This is the case with Daniel, and this is where he comes into the story in Daniel chapter 1, verse 6. Among them from the Judahites were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the chief eunuch gave them names. He gave the name Belteshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. So here's one of the questions is, first of all, why did they change their names? Okay, they brought him into captivity, and the first thing they did was change their names. Well, here's why. Again, getting in context, these boys, these four guys we're talking about, were anywhere from 12 to 15 years old. And so you've got like potentially middle schoolers to freshmen in high school, which you all know is a very, very influential age. It's been a while since I was in middle school, but I know that even now, looking at what some of our children are going through, and maybe what some of you guys are going through in high school, man, it's even harder now than it was when I was in school. And so these young boys were at a very, very influential age, which is why the king said, hey, bring me some of the youngest, best, and brightest. Because he thought, they're still young enough that I can change them and shape them. And the reason they changed their names were because their names represented worship of the one true God. And so when they were taken, they stripped them of their names and they gave them new names tied to the false gods of the Babylonians. Now, in this culture, names were a big deal. Like today, I can say Craig or Shannon or Chelsea or Scott, and it's just a name. It doesn't have any real meaning behind it. But in that day, when you had a name, it identified who you were. Your name actually meant something. It represented who you were, what you believed, and more importantly, your name represented who you worshiped. And so what they did was they took them in and they said, we're going to change your names because our gods are greater than your God. Our gods defeated your God, and we're going to give you new names. We're going to rename you and give you a new identity to constantly remind you every time we say your name that we won, that our gods are victorious, that the God of Israel was too weak to protect you from us. So they were stripping them of their identity completely. So they were given new names, they were given a new diet, they were supposed to eat the food prepared for the king, which sounds pretty awesome, right? Think about it, you're 12 years old, Babylonians come in, they defeat you, you're taken as a slave into Babylon, they're like, okay, now here's your punishment. You need to learn and you need to eat the food prepared for the king. You're thinking, man, steak and wine at every meal at 12 years old? Sounds pretty awesome, right? But here's the problem. For Daniel and his friends, the problem was all the food and wine was dedicated to the pagan gods of the Babylonians. And this presented a big, big, big problem for Daniel and his friends because if they ate that food, if they ate it, they were going against their God. And so here's what happens in verse 8. It says, Daniel determined. Everybody say determined. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Now, this is really important. Don't miss what just happened here. Daniel didn't fight back when they took him into captivity. He didn't fight back when they gave him a new name. He didn't fight back when they said that he had to learn their language. He didn't fight back when they said that he needed to learn their laws and their culture. He didn't fight back against any of that because none of that changed who he was. Because Daniel was like, look, you can give me a new name. You can teach me your language and some things about your books, but that's really not going to change who I am. I worship God now, I'll worship God tomorrow, and I'll always worship God. So you can change my diet, you can change my name, you can do any of that kind of stuff. But in the end of the day, it's not changing who I am. It's not a big deal to stand against that kind of stuff. But here, when they're trying to make me eat food that's dedicated to false gods, this is where he makes a stand. This is where he makes a stand. Now remember, we're talking about a 12-year-old. And he says, okay, I'm fine with all that other stuff, but this is where I draw the line in the sand. You can give me a new name, but you can't tell me to do something that goes against what I believe. You can't tell me to go against my God. Now again, a 12-year-old is saying this. A 12-year-old. How many of us at that time would have been like, look, it's just not that big of a deal. But here's a 12-year-old making a stand for what he believes. And here's the best part of this whole story. Here's my favorite part. It says that Daniel determined. Before he was ever faced with the temptation of having that steak and that wine set before him, because think about how hard that would have been. You're hungry, you've been taken to captivity, and all of a sudden, here's a steak. It's like, man, I am pretty hungry. But before the temptation hit, Daniel determined ahead of time what he was going to do or not do. He made the decision to do what he knew was right. See, here's why I like Daniel so much. Every other person in the Bible, every other hero of the faith, they compromised and they messed up in some area. Noah got drunk. Moses killed a guy. Abraham tried to go around God's plan and got his wife's servant pregnant. David slept with another man's wife. Like, these are some of our heroes of the faith. These are some of the guys that were men after God's own heart, that God used despite their flaws. But all these guys made huge compromises in their lives. But Daniel determined at such a young age to do what was right. Daniel was blameless as much as a man can be. And he was going to follow God regardless of the consequences it would have on his life. And I would say that how closely you follow Jesus in this culture all depends on what you determine ahead of time that you will or will not do. How closely you follow Jesus in this culture all depends on what you determine ahead of time that you will or will not do. For example, you can't wait to make a decision of what you will or will not do if you're in a relationship and find yourself downstairs under the blankets watching The Notebook, right? And then you're crying out like, oh, Jesus, keep me from temptation. It's like, well, you shouldn't have put yourself in that position. Right? If you want to remain sexually pure, then you need to make a decision ahead of time that I'm not going to put myself in physically challenging situations. I'm not going to wait until I'm under the blanket and then be like, oh man, now what do I do? No, I'm going to determine ahead of time, like, first of all, just don't watch The Notebook. Second of all, don't put yourself in that situation. Determine ahead of time. Ahead of time. You will, as Paul told Timothy, flee from anything resembling sexual immorality. Or maybe some of us in here need to make a predetermined decision to honor God with our eyes. And before temptation ever hits, to say, I'm going to install some accountability stuff on my phone, on my computer, on my tablet, whatever else, because, man, I know that, I'm a human and I get tempted. So before temptation comes, I'm going to make a predetermined decision that I'm going to guard myself against some of these things. Maybe some of you need to make a predetermined decision that, when you're at work and everybody else is talking terribly about their wives, that you're not going to do that. You're not going to fall into the trap of bad-mouthing your wife or your husband because, you want to be a godly spouse because you love your husband or you love your wife. Or maybe you need to make a decision that you're not going to ride alone in a car with someone of the opposite sex because, you just want to avoid the appearance of evil. Or maybe some of you need to determine what you will do. Not what you won't do, but maybe you need to make a determination of what you will do. Chelsea and I have made a decision that no matter what, we're never going to miss church. So even if we're on vacation or traveling and we can't go to we'll just try to find a physical church that we can go to. But if we can't, well, guess what? Right now we're streaming church online. People are watching. And so we've decided that we're not going to miss church. It's too important for our family. So if we're traveling, if we're in Colorado or Cancun or wherever it might be, we're going to tune into church because we value that's a priority in our lives. We value that together. So we've determined ahead of time that fellowshipping with believers is going to be a priority in our lives. Now, doing or not doing all these things, it's going to make you different. It's going to make you a little bit weird to some of the world. It's going, people are probably going to think that you've taken this Jesus thing a little bit too far. But to follow Jesus means to stand out. To follow Jesus means to stand out. And you will at some point, this is a promise, you will at some point, if you're following Jesus, stand out for what you believe. You will at some point stand out for what you believe, because you'll find that the closer you are to Jesus, the more you're going to stand out to the world. So here's what happens in the end of our story. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version. Daniel and his friends were like, no, we're not going to eat that food. Instead, give us vegetables to eat and give us water to drink, and we promise you that God's going to take care of us and we're going to be healthy. They didn't throw a fit. They didn't post out on Facebook how unfair this was like a normal teenager would do. They were just like, hey, just allow us to follow our convictions. This is something that's really important to us as we follow God. So just allow us to do this. So they just very quietly stood for what they believed. And because of their faithfulness, they not only found favor in God's eyes, but actually they also found favor in the eyes of an evil worldly king. Check out what happened here in verse 17. God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. And Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. And at the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the chief interviewed them, and among all of them, nobody was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king. Here's what's cool. Had they compromised, we would not be talking about them today. Had they just been quiet and eaten the food and asked for forgiveness later, they wouldn't be worth remembering. But because they were willing to take a stand for what they believed in, because Daniel and his friends made a stand that they would live godly lives in an ungodly age, they had a bigger impact on the world than the world had on them. And that's going to become like crystal clear evident as we continue going throughout the life of Daniel and his friends, just seeing how much they began to shape the culture. And here's what's amazing. Every single one of us in here will face the same opportunity in our lives. You will either change the world or you're going to be changed by the world. You have to know what you believe. Craig Rochelle says it like this: I would rather be remembered for standing out than forgotten for blending in. I would rather be remembered for standing out, for standing up, for being willing to look like an idiot because of what I believe. He says, I would rather be remembered for standing out than forgotten for blending in with what everybody else is doing, that everybody else is saying. Because listen, if you're always blending in, then you're not a fully committed follower to Jesus. You're just half-heartedly following him. And some of you, if you were really, really honest, you'd be able to say that, most of my friends, most of my family, most of the kids at my school, they don't know I'm a Christian because I'm so good at blending in with the world. I'm much, if you had to do a survey, I probably look way more like the world than I look like Jesus. And some of you can probably recognize that about yourselves, or maybe you've started down a path and you say, man, I've made some small compromises in my life, and I feel like I'm like that car out of alignment, and I'm finding myself in this season where I'm just straying further and further away from God. The amazing thing is that this morning you can get your life back on track. Not next week or next month or, when I get out of college, then that's what I'll do. But right now, we have a God that can give us a new opportunity and a fresh start. You can course correct today. You don't have to wait for the mistakes of tomorrow. But you can get your life changed today. See, here's the thing. As we talk about standing out, we don't stand out to make a statement. We stand out to make a difference. We don't stand out for what we believe just so we can be that loudmouth on the street corner that no one really likes. We stand out. We stand out for what we believe. And we make a difference in this world. This all goes back to what I was saying earlier about all this stuff happening on the East Coast. We're not going to stand out just because we think we're better than anybody, because we're not. We're going to stand out because we want to make a difference in this world. We want to see people in this world come to know Jesus like we've come to know Jesus. And so when our reputations are on the line, we're going to stand. When our relationships are on the line, we're going to stand. When our job, our career is on the line, we're going to stand. And if our very lives are on the line, still we will stand for what we believe. We're going to stand up for what we believe. Why? Well, because Jesus stood for us. And Jesus noticed the position we were in, and he was willing to make a stand. And so he came to earth while we were still sinners. And in John chapter 1, it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. That means that Jesus entered our mess. So some of you would say, man, my life is crazy. This world is dark. Like, you wouldn't choose that for yourself, but God chose that. So the word became flesh. Jesus entered into our mess, and he lived and he dwelt among us, and he lived a perfect life. And then at the very end, he stood and he took our sins upon himself by giving his life on a cross. See, Jesus stood when it would have been easier to sit. In the garden, remember what Jesus prayed? He said, Father, if there's any way, God, if there's any possibility, would you please take this cup from me? Basically, I know what's coming, and I really don't want to die this horrible death that I know is coming my way. But then he said something amazing. He said, but nevertheless, your will and not my will be done. God, if you can take it away, that's great. But no matter what, I will stand, because this is why I came. I didn't come to blend in with the world. I didn't come to be changed by the world, but I came to save the world. And man, if you don't know that truth this morning, that invitation is still for you today. And that is good news. Jesus gave us life so that we could stand for him, so that we could live godly lives in a godless age. And instead of being changed by the world, we could be